All right, so thanks for joining us for our now third meeting as we embark on a rewrite of the Climate Action Plan. This is our sort of gap identification meeting. We already had our level set meeting and our benchmark meeting, and we're moving into our gap identification. So that's what we will focus on today. I can bring up the agenda. We did post the agenda and then the work plan on the website for those that want to reference it, but I will share my screen now. Still, I'm just so not used to Zoom. Share screen. Okay, so you all can see that. It's hard to tell what you can see on Zoom. All right, so yeah, we are having our gap identification. I'll provide a few updates of what's been going on sort of at the higher level, the council level, mostly the subcommittee, the steering committee level, and then Alice will kind of walk us through the work plan just to keep us grounded and pointed in the right direction as we progress through these months in the work. And then this level really, we call it gap identification, but we really want to try to keep it high level for right now. So we're going to go through, Marion's going to provide an overview of the pathways and strategies, and maybe a couple of other people might be chiming into that. And then we passed around a survey, a very brief survey, and we'll go over the results of that survey and then talk about how from that discussion we want to move forward into figuring out how we're actually going to approach this work as we start to dig in, especially over the next couple of months and really deeply in the fall. We'll have some time for public comment and then hopefully be able to be organized enough to wrap up and have some pretty formalized next steps. So I wanted to start by we have a couple of new members joining us from Just Transitions. Danielle is not able to join us today, but Anna is here. So Anna, it would be great if you could just take a minute or two and just introduce yourselves. And in the interest of time, I'm going to ask everybody else if they could, in the chat, put your name, your sort of affiliation outside of this council, and then if you are involved in any other part of the council, put that also in the chart, just so Anna can have an idea of who we all are without taking the time to go through that. So yeah, if you guys can do that, and then Anna, sure, if you want to introduce yourself, that would be great too.
Hello, I'm Anna Gunther. I use she, her pronouns. I live in White River Junction. I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, but I will have been in Vermont 20 years this fall. I originally came to the Just Transitions Committee because of my project work at my nonprofit job, Vital Communities. I think specifically energy burden work with mobile home residents and e-bikes, sort of an equity-centered transportation effort. And I organized with our local White River Junction Pride group. And I think that's the combination of factors that led to me being on the Just Transition Subcommittee. So thank you for having me.
Great, yeah, thanks. We're excited to have Just Transitions have a presence for sure. Paula is also on the subcommittee. And then, like we said, we'll have Danielle. Danielle has some scheduling conflicts, but should be able to join us more over the summer, which will be great, as we definitely want to make sure that we are incorporating equity. We'll see from the survey results that it's definitely an important thing on our minds, and we just want to be cognizant of that in every step that we take. So we're happy to have you along helping us with that. Let's see. Oh, I did want to also mention, I think there's been a little bit of, people aren't very clear, especially with the staff role of what those folks bring to this. And I just wanted to just take a second just to say that they are members of this subcommittee, state staff. They don't have a voting voice on the subcommittee, but definitely want to make sure that you feel welcome and open to provide input. I think it's critical for everyone else to understand what the state is doing in this space. And so having you all on helps for everybody to understand the whole picture of what's happening in the state and how things need to be changed or need to be, there needs to be more capacity or whatever it is. But I just want to make sure that everybody feels like if, I didn't want anyone to feel like I'm not a member, I'm not supposed to say anything. What am I supposed to do here? So if there's any questions on that sort of that role, you can ask them now, or you can follow up with me. But yeah, pretty much in my mind, a member just like any other member, except when it comes to the voting. So I don't know, is there anybody else has anything more to say about that, or if there's any questions, I'll leave a little space for that right now. Okay, we'll move on. Let me look at my notes. So we have to approve the minutes from May 10th, and I can provide, why don't we just, I'll bring those up. I think I have those up somewhere. Oh, can't. How do I move this? Yeah, I have those minutes here. They're linked in the agenda. If you want to just take a few minutes to look those over, why don't we just do that, and I'll sit quietly for a couple of minutes and read through those and make sure that there's nothing that was inaccurate or omitted, and then we'll see if we can do an approval. Okay, any comments on those?
I would move we accept them.
I would agree. Anybody opposed?
I'd second that.
Okay, sounds like we'll consider those approved then. Okay, so going back to the agenda, I think I will, well, maybe I'll keep sharing because I think I have a bunch of things I wanted to share actually. Screenshot. So yeah, I wanted to just provide a few updates. There's the Climate Action Office is holding Climate Action Plan kickoff meetings next week. And They are holding 2 meetings, public meetings, basically just discussions to support folks in learning about what the initial plan had in it. I would imagine a lot of the people are going to be at these meetings already have an understanding of that, but understanding the priorities as we move into a revision, and then just kind of supporting the public in what they want to see in that. So just 2 engagement meetings. I don't know, Marion, what did you just put in the chat? I saw it pop up, but I don't have enough screens.
I'm putting the links with information in to register. I think these are public meetings and are really, the Climate Action Office is logistically supporting them, but they're for the council and they are the council and subcommittees meetings. And so would really encourage folks to join. There are going to be breakout groups facilitated by your co-chairs, asking questions of the public around what they'd like to see in the next climate action plan. So this is really an opportunity for you all as subcommittee members and for the council broadly to hear about what the public is interested in. So I put the links to register in the chat.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard for me to tell if I'm sharing my screen.
Yes, you are.
Okay, it doesn't have like the red box around it like it does in Teams. So I just put those dates up there, and I did try it out. You can hold your phone up and take a picture of those scans if you want to register for either of those events right from there, or Marion put the links. So they are asking folks to register. So if you plan to attend either one or both, please do register on those.
And do you know if these are the same meeting or are they progressive?
They're the same meeting. There's
Okay.
2 opportunities.
Okay.
All right. And then I also wanted to mention, I don't know if folks have seen that the Climate Action Office is doing a lot of outreach right now, and they have quarterly reports on engagement, and I find them very interesting. So I just wanted to make people aware of those. Let's see, they are listed on the resources page. I'll share my screen for that too. And I kind of knew that this resources page was there, but just got reminded of it this morning, and it has, you know, everything that I was going to talk about in this update is on here. And this is the last quarterly report. So you can just click on it and see what has been going on for engagement.
Andrea, we're not seeing your screen. I think we're just seeing your desktop.
Why is that happening?
You might have the wrong screen shared.
Oh.
Looks good.
Okay. Were you all just looking at yourselves? I hate when that happens.
No, we were looking at your desktop.
Like,
That looks like
that's
mine.
more embarrassing. Okay, so yeah, so quarterly report is in here, some of the other documents, the engagement plan. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, as people start to get, it's just different ways to make sure that you're staying plugged in. We can't possibly go over everything that's being posted or that's happening at the steering committee or climate council level here at these subcommittee meetings and still make progress on our work. So I would definitely encourage you all to check this out every now and again and just see what's being posted. I know we've talked about sometimes it's hard to find documents that relate to our subcommittee, but these are sort of like the more overarching documents and stuff. So it's a nice place to be able to try to find those. And then one of the things that I wanted to show, let's see, is the engagement plan. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So this is a sort of a schedule of the plan for engagement coming out of the Climate Action Office and in support of the Climate Council work and our subcommittee work. And so that is on the resource page. So feel free to pop that open at another time and look into it in a little more detail. But I just sort of wanted to call out some of these different items. Here's the kickoff meetings that are happening next week in June. And then the intent is for the Climate Action Office, I would imagine Sophie, coming to subcommittee meetings and sort of debriefing on what is displayed there or what is being heard at these kickoff meetings. And then again, coming into the subcommittees to plan specific engagement over July and August, you know, engagement for our group and how to coordinate that with the rest of what's going on, engagement for all the rest of the subcommittees and the overall climate action plan. And then, you know, helping us with that. Stakeholder focus groups happening September, October. Going back to the resource page, there was a few different things that the steering committee talked about on Monday, and one of those which we've talked about a little bit here is the prioritization and the criteria for that and the way that it was done in the last action plan, and if there's going to be changes to that. And so that's just sort of starting to be a topic of discussion at the steering committee. It has not been presented at all to the overall climate council, but let's see. Is that one on here? Prioritization. If you go to the steering committee meeting on the calendar from Monday, you'll see a link to this document, and it just provides an overview of, it definitely follows what was done in the original, the initial climate action plan with the different criteria for prioritization, the impact, the cost effectiveness, and the co-benefits, and all the different things that we're going to have to weigh if we as we move forward into this work. And it gives a little bit more guidance about how to consider that. And I don't think we need to get into that very deeply at this meeting right now, but I wanted to make folks aware that it's being generated, and we'll provide updates as it's you know, refined to the point where they're rolling it out. But it will go from the steering committee to the climate council and then out to us, and we'll certainly want to dig into this quite a bit as we start to form our recommendations and figure out how to prioritize them, you know, late summer and into the fall. And then they also talked about at the steering committee additional guidance for subcommittees. So they had that sort of overarching document that they let out with, and we reviewed at our April meeting. And now they're just putting a little bit more meat on the bones for that. And it's in draft. I think there is some input was received on that from the steering committee. I'm not sure if that was incorporated yet in this draft, but they didn't want to delay getting it out to the subcommittees. And so I definitely encourage you all to walk through that. And I, in all honesty, haven't had a chance to really dig into this. But I will, and we will, as we kind of walk through, you know, move into our next steps, and just things to consider in more detail than was laid out in the original guidance. And I don't know, Marianne, if you have anything more to say about this document right now.
I do not.
Yeah, it'll be presented to the Climate Council, I believe, at their July meeting. July 8th is their next meeting. And then, you know, will presumably come out as a final document to us. But again, we'll dig into that more as we jump into the work. I don't think I had anything else on that topic. Any questions on any of that sort of framework stuff?
I have one thing to add, Andrea. So not a question, but just to your comment around the work that Sophie and the Climate Action Office are doing around engagement.
Mhm.
Just to elaborate on that a bit, if folks weren't aware, the Climate Action Office has a sort of long-term contract with some facilitation support from Consensus Building Institute, but they also work closely with some community leaders on the ground in Vermont to really facilitate and engage marginalized and vulnerable populations. So Sophie and the CBI team have been facilitating focus groups focused on communities where English isn't their first language, and have been expanding to do other focus group conversations, as well as attending events really around the state that aren't maybe primarily focused on climate, but tabling and kind of being there to ask questions and have conversations, really meeting folks where they are. So that's a lot of what is summarized in that engagement report that Andrea shared. But Sophie flagged for me to kind of tee up for us as a subcommittee, as she and the team continue to do sort of on the ground focus groups and engagement work with Vermonters across the state. They're going to be really looking to subcommittees like ours to guide what types of questions they should be asking or what types of conversations they should be having with folks. And so I think something for us to think about as we start to narrow in on what we want our focus to be today and then to continue in July is really thinking about a specific set of questions to share with that community engagement team that they can be facilitating and having conversations with on the ground. And that information will come back to us to guide our recommendations and work to develop our revise our section of the CAP. So I think just something to keep in mind in terms of, both who we want to hear from, but also what we want to hear from, because there's a great opportunity to do that through Sophie and the CBI team.
Yeah, thank you, Marion. I wanted to do that and I totally spaced it. So specifically, looking at the question that I just put in the chat, what will be helpful and meaningful for our work as we move forward. And we'll certainly have quite a few touch points in the coming months with Sophie and hearing about the engagement. So I'm sure this will come up again, but in the meantime, if you have input on that now, or at any point, definitely be sharing that. And I think with that, we can move into the work plan, Alice.
Okay, could you bring up on the screen the work plan graphic that we have?
Yeah, I think. This one?
Yep, perfect. I'm going to refer to this graphic as I describe the work that we have a subcommittee of our subcommittee. And at the last meeting, Scott, David, Marion, Andrea, and myself, I'm sorry if I forget anybody, but we formed a small group to actually work on forming for us a work plan that will give us a roadmap on where we're at and what we need to do. If you look at this graphic, it's divided into two phases, planning and actually drafting what we want to write and edit for our part of the climate action plan. So right now with this meeting here and the meeting before that, we're right in the middle of the planning phase, number one. And what we're looking at now, and through the survey that Andrea put out and the conversations we'll have today, is to start identifying what we feel we need to add, edit, enhance, what the gaps are that we see in the current action plan, and prepare what we feel we need to work on and add. And we're also in this planning stage looking at suggestions on how we can bring information to us by meeting with the cross-sector committee or the science subcommittee, or any information that we feel we need to understand and help write what we identify as the gaps that we want to enhance. We also would look for recommendations of any kind of outside organizations that can give us guidance. I think the video of the presentation that the State Hazard Mitigation Plan did for the Climate Council is an excellent one to go back and look at on their website. Also, I would recommend, in terms of gathering information, being aware of any climate webinars that are available to us and attend what you can. There's one coming up, I think in 2 weeks, of presentation by the climatologist from UVM talking about climate challenges. And one of those I'll put the link into the chat. Those are the kinds of things that the group can bring in here, and also the kinds of things we can do on our own, attending these types of webinar to enhance our knowledge and facts that we would need to add to our draft. So right now, through April through August, we're in the planning phase. We need to understand what we want to look at and then prioritize that, and say these are the most important ones. And throughout this, we need to be bringing in Just Transitions Working Group and our social justice theme into the climate action plan. I've attended a few of the Just Transition Committee meetings, and they're excellent. And I will say that as I'm writing the regional plan for the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission, we're also using the guidelines from our Climate Action Just Transition Subcommittee. They're really that good. So right now we're right here, right in planning. It's what will continue today. And by September through December, we'll actually move into the shovel to the ground, the real work of drafting our edits and our additions to the climate action plan. And we'll have draft recommendations and final recommendations. And at that point, September to December, we're looking at needing bi-weekly meetings. We're going to need more meetings to do this. And we can see how we do it. We haven't fully fleshed out how that's done, whether we do it in full committee meetings, or again, we could come up with something like subcommittees of our subcommittee that are assigned particular portions or particular topics that we've identified. But you can use this graphic as the outline of what our subcommittee came up with. And then the document itself enhances this slide with where we're at and what we talked about. And you can read the full document to fill in what this slide is outlining for our work. Climate Council, Jane Lazorchak just sent around an email with additional support that the steering committee came up with to help the subcommittees that are doing this work. There is an email and a link to that document, and I'll post that link also in the chat. And I guess we're really digging in now. I really like in the minutes, whoever made the comment on where the climate action plan whiffed, that was a great word. And that's what we're looking at. Where did we whiff? and we whiffed on the pandemic. We don't want to whiff on other things. And keep in mind that this week coming up is a really intense, very early heat wave. And we really don't want to whiff, thinking about it, talk more about heat. In Waitsfield, we've identified that as a major hazard as we're working on our local hazard mitigation plan. So that's about it. If anybody has any questions or you didn't think about, please ask or tell us what you think we left out.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I definitely hope that you all were able to look at that some. Certainly this graphic being the overarching and just recognizing, you know, we put final work plan on the agenda as the topic, but it's not going to be final really until we're done with the work. It's going to morph a little bit each time, and some things will shift from month to month. But overall, that's sort of like our guiding direction of where we need to be and our milestones. And so, you know, when this says prioritization of gaps, that first one's gonna be at a higher level, and then we're gonna prioritize our actions once we get that done. So there's a couple of different times when we'll be trying to prioritize our work. And so, yeah, if anybody has any input on that now, or anything that they would like to discuss as a group that just stands out as something that really jumped out to them, or something that bothered them about what we put in, that's what this is all about, and that's what these task groups will be about, to go back and just put something together to present to this group so that you can have that overall input at that point. So all of it is a working group. It's just a matter of the best way to break it up so that we can make progress and not bog everyone down.
And what I forgot to say is that we also talked about not being stuck in one of those blocks, that there's probably going to be times, and there should be times, when we move back and forth between identification and prioritization. We might change our minds here and there or want more information. So even when we get to phase 2, which is the actual drafting of what we're going to recommend, we may need to go back and get more information. We might say, gee, something's missing here. And we go back into the first phase to look for more information from subcommittees or outside resources.
And, you know, I'll just say that we do have some time to talk about that a little bit more if we want to. And if folks aren't ready to, or they dig in a little bit deeper and see something that they have a suggestion for change, that you can always just let me know about it, email me and provide a suggestion. Or if you have suggestions for who we should be bringing in at certain points, that would be certainly welcome as well. All right, well, with that, should we jump into the pathways and strategies, Marion, or do you want to share your screen for that?
Sure, I can do that. All right, so as today is really focused on gap identification, Andrea and David noted that it would be really helpful and important to first ground us in what exists in the sort of current climate action plan. I know folks have reviewed this. There have been spreadsheets and other documents shared around that include all of the pathways, strategies, and actions from the last climate action plan, but we wanted to provide some space to update folks about, or not update, but really walk through the 5 pathways that this subcommittee worked on drafting for the last climate action plan, review the strategies, and then hear from some of the folks who assisted in drafting it the last time around about what some of those key actions or sort of a flavor of those actions are. And I think what this will really help us do is understand what exists in the current plan so that we can have a conversation about where you all think there are gaps, or as Alice noted, where potentially the cap sort of whiffed in certain sectors or areas where we might want to focus our work further. I will say this might be the most boring presentation I've ever put together. Apologies in advance. If you all want to follow along in the sort of matrix that is with the pathways, strategies, and actions, that's an addendum to the climate action plan. I'm not going to show action language on my screen because it's just too much. So let me put it in the chat for you all here. There is a matrix. It's more simple than the matrix that has the updates on the actions, but that's what I'm showing on the screen here. And if you wanted to follow along and actually get a flavor or read what some of the actions are under each of the pathways, you can do that with the link in the chat. And just to kind of walk you all through what that looks like. So in the matrix link I put in the chat, pathways are in the green row here, which I will share on the slides on my screen. I will also be sharing the strategies, which are in the sort of salmon colored pink row. What I won't be showing are the actions. There's too many to put on a slide. But again, if you want to follow along with this matrix, you can do that by looking at the actions. And then one thing I will note with this matrix in particular that's important to kind of consider and think about as we review what was in the 2021 Climate Action Plan. This matrix includes all of the actions that the subcommittee drafted. Once actions were drafted, they went through a process of ranking those actions through criteria that yielded high, medium, and low rankings. And only high and some medium actions were actually included in the Climate Action Plan. So the last column of this matrix, again, that's linked in the chat for you all, has an X where the action was included and sort of the full text of the Climate Action Plan, but it also includes the actions that were ranked as medium or low that were not included in the Climate Action Plan. The council made a decision to include all actions that subcommittees drafted, including those that weren't ultimately included in the CAP language because of a medium or low ranking, but it's included in the addendum to the CAP here. So again, hopefully this is helpful if you want to follow along on your own, but we can always refer back to it or pull the matrix up if folks want to take a look at actions. But I think today our conversation is going to be focused a little higher level, so we're keeping it at the pathway and strategy level, and we'll just give a flavor of some of the actions. So I'm now going to move through, again, my boring slides, apologies, the pathways and the strategies. Again, hopefully folks are familiar with this and you've taken a look at what's in the 2021 CAP, but I think we wanted to use this to ground us in what exists so that we can talk about gaps and where we want to focus our time over the next year. So pathway one, and I will just note, I'm going to have some folks kind of help me present some of the other pathways. These were subcommittee members or state staff who helped draft particular pathways for the last time around. I was sort of providing support to the subcommittee, and so have some familiarity with all of the pathways, but we'll note we have some subject matter expertise that are going to kind of help me tag team some of the pathways as we go through them. So pathway one, I don't think we have anyone, correct me if I'm wrong, on the subcommittee now currently who was drafted this particular pathway set of strategies and actions. But this one was really focused on increasing capacity for planning and implementation and addressing inequities of under-resourced communities. So you can see the 4 strategies on the screen here. I won't read through all of them. But the sort of task group made up of a handful of folks from the subcommittee really focused on 4 different strategies to help us think about and ensure that we can help build capacity for municipalities primarily for their climate resilience planning and implementation. So those actions and strategies focused on providing tools and resources to help think about and address climate vulnerabilities and develop climate resilience plans, establish permanent statewide funding and technical support for planning and implementation, looking at cross-sector collaborative efforts to align, share best practices, and leverage resources, and then increasing community participation in local government and civic engagement. So just a flavor of some of the actions that were included in there. Again, you can see them all listed out in the matrix that I linked in the chat for you all. Actions included recommendations to increase funding to regional planning commissions and local municipalities to support climate and energy planning, creating and increasing funding for a permanent state fund for design and implementation of local and regional climate adaptation projects, establishing a state level individual assistance program to provide financial assistance to uninsured or underinsured households, ensuring that we're completing climate change impact assessments for Vermont's vulnerable commercial and natural resource-based industries, and then an action around requiring remote meeting options and call-in options for meetings of public bodies. So just a flavor of the actions included in here, but again, Pathway 1 really focused on how do we increase capacity for our municipalities to really build resilience into their planning and project implementation. Moving along to Pathway 2, which I think I'm going to turn to Anne Margolis to help me with this one. Anne, I'll just overview the pathway for you and then hand it over to you if you want to add some detail. So Pathway 2 really focused on proactively and strategically investing to enhance resilience in our key infrastructure sectors: transportation, communication, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure. There were 4 strategies included under this pathway that focused on foundational support to ensure investments, ensuring that organizations are prepared to respond and recover quickly to disruptions, increasing the resilience of our critical infrastructure to disruptions, and then improving system efficiency, reliability, and redundancies. But Anne, I wonder if you want to give a little sense of your work in drafting this and what some of the actions focused on.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Marion. There was a cohort of us, I think 4 or 5, that worked on this, primarily led by Joe Segali, who was coming at it from the transportation perspective. I was coming at it from the energy perspective, as was Mike Burke from GMP, who couldn't be here today, but he's still on this subcommittee. And then sort of the other areas were water and wastewater, where A&R would have sort of the expertise there primarily, and then communications, which also kind of comes from the department, but isn't sort of personally an area I work in. I do want to mention, this was the focus here was on one of the infrastructure areas was energy, but both Mike and I kind of came at it from the electricity and the grid perspective. So I'm not sure sort of as much thought went into it from sort of the unregulated fuels perspective. Obviously, there's a nexus there with mitigation as well, mitigation of greenhouse gases, but that is, there are interdependencies amongst all of these, particularly, energy infrastructure. The grid provides services that are critical for communications and the operation of water and wastewater facilities. And then sort of transportation is a necessity to reach energy infrastructure, for example. And you can imagine all of the different ways there are interdependencies here. I think, those words were chosen very deliberately, proactively, and strategically in all of these investments. Whether it's in redundancies or hardening or sort of new technologies, these are going to come at at a cost, and that would be borne either by taxpayers or, potentially ratepayers if it's a grid, or if it's a private water wastewater system, by those beneficiaries. So, in terms of stewarding, the public dollar, being proactive and strategic is very important. One of the areas we were really trying to focus on the last time around was pursuing some of the federal funding that was coming out, the Recovery Act funding, infrastructure funding. IRA hadn't been passed at the time, but we had some actions that were really about focusing on trying to reap as much federal funding, pursue as much and reap as much federal funding as possible to achieve some of these goals. At a future point in time, I think we could dig more into how successful or not that has been, but it's certainly going to be a lot of investment required here and on an ongoing basis. So the other piece here is being strategic about it, making sure that we're not trying to do everything everywhere all at once, but we're trying to really tackle the highest needs by infrastructure sector, and come up with a framework and a sort of a planning paradigm to do that. So all of these sound really very high level and great, but sort of the actions underneath each one dig into more specifics on what can be done. I could certainly go into more depth on sort of the grid side of things and where we are on that, but I will say there's been a lot of movement on that in the last several years. A lot of discussion of what does resilience mean from a grid perspective. How do we come up with the design standards, come up with the sort of matrix of threats and vulnerabilities to the grid in order to then inform what are our options and alternatives, costs and benefits for mitigating those threats and vulnerabilities. How do we come up with a benefit cost analysis for doing that and a framework for selecting solutions, and then figure out how to pay for them and who pays. I guess I could go on, but I'd be curious if there's any sort of questions around this. There's a lot that we've done, I think, in the last 2 years to be responsive to some of the actions under these. There's still so much more to be done. So I think narrowing in this time around, in particular, something that's been on my mind lately is the idea of coming up, sort of understanding where we're at with the temperature changes that have been experienced so far, and whether sort of the predictions for impacts to severe weather are sort of on track with what we expected, or actually potentially maybe worse than what we expected, and how do we actually forecast that out into the next 5, 10, 15 years. I don't know if others agree, but things are changing not in a linear fashion, but in order to kind of get ahead of the changes and prepare for them, there's a balance between doing everything all at once in a way that's not affordable for people. Affordability of your energy bills is something that's really important. You have to be able to pay for your air conditioning or your heat pump. We talk about the threat of heat, for example. So there's we want people for mitigation purposes to switch to electric vehicles. So putting, hardening everything on the grid and putting it all on the electric bill also has ripple effects for some of our other goals in cross mitigation, for example. So I think in general, having a sense, maybe this is where we get like state climatologists to come in and give us a sense of where we are compared with 3 years ago, and where we may be 3, 6, 9 years, yes, you're not on 3-year terms with the climate plan, but every 4 years, I think we need a check-in on figuring out where we are on sort of the trajectory of impacts from severe weather, and maybe that could help us focus in on the most important near-term actions to take in this particular iteration of the plan. So I'll stop there. Any questions?
That was great. Thanks, Anne. Do folks have questions about Pathway 2?
I have a quick one based on what Anne just said. So I know other states have mandated that infrastructure planning goes by a set data set of climate change. So like they will actually say, we are, validating that we expect this much sea level rise, or we expect this much heat. The infrastructure planning that happens in Vermont, is that true here? Or are you basically saying there is no sanctioned kind of trusted climate data that all infrastructure planning is oriented around?
I can't really speak for the non-electricity sectors. That I think there's others here on the call that could speak to them. I would say in the electricity realm, the utilities all have to do integrated resource planning to meet to part of that includes reliability, resilience. There's a whole lot of design standards, et cetera, around that. But there's not in particular one set of sort of climate projections or data that the utilities are required to or even recommended to refer to in that planning. For folks' awareness, we at the department have recommended that the commission open a resilience proceeding. And I don't know if they're going to do that or not, but we're also considering applying to the national labs for technical assistance for this proceeding, or if the proceeding doesn't happen, to have them assist the department in updating the integrated resource planning guidance for the utilities around resilience planning. And I think that's a great area. It's one that I think about a lot, is sort of, it's easy to think about the solutions for resilience, but what are the actual hazards and threats, and at a more granular spatial level too. You know, we have the municipal vulnerability index, or I guess it's the indicators tool now. You know, that could be an area where intense focus could be paid to selecting sort of the individual map layers, which sort of have different sensitivities, different sort of time periods or climate impacts, from what I understand. So selecting sort of the right set of criteria within the indicators tool for all of the sort of utilities to use in their planning. But it's, I will say, all the different utilities are, they have very different capabilities, levels of resources and staff. So to make this as useful as possible, I think it would have to be kind of high level, but pointing to something that could be, you know, very clearly used and incorporated as sort of, this is the threat assessment that you should all be looking toward.
That's great. Great question, Candace. In the interest of time, I think we're going to move on, but really encourage folks, I think, as you hear the overview from Anne and from others, and my very high level just reading of the text on the screen, if you have questions about either did actions address, or did the sort of subcommittee last time address this or that, I think write it down. We're going to get to a place where we're looking for you all to really inform where there are potential gaps and where we might want to focus our efforts this time around. And so those are great ideas and things to keep in mind as we kind of continue our conversation. So thanks so much, Anne. And again, if other folks have questions or thoughts, feel free to write them down, and we'll get to those in just a minute. All right, so moving on to pathway 3, which I think Anne Lawless is going to help me summarize in just a minute here. So pathway 3 is an interesting one. I know we've had some conversations about this already at a subcommittee level, because it really does focus on reducing the use of fossil fuels across sort of, you'll see in the pathway here, municipal, school district, residential, university, and hospital use, particularly in rural areas. And then the pathway goes on to explain that this should be done through equitable best practices that address unique challenges of rural communities. I think, you know, if folks filled out the survey that Andrea shared last week, or earlier this week, it highlighted the charge of the Rural Resilience Subcommittee as written in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And one of the places where this subcommittee has to focus is on recommending best practices for fossil fuel use reduction for municipalities and rural communities, and also really focusing on the pressures that sort of climate change adaptation will pose on our most rural populations. And so because of that charge, and really the need to focus on the impacts that sort of climate change adaptation will place on rural communities, as well as recommending a set of best practices for fossil fuel reduction, the subcommittee, a group of folks on the subcommittee really focused on how do we recommend gathering data and providing tools for these kind of sets of groups to reduce their fossil fuel use. I think there's a lot of interest, and we can continue this discussion around how to best do this, acknowledging that the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee really focuses on reduction of fossil fuel use, greenhouse gas mitigation, and how we ensure we're meeting our emissions reductions requirements, and where that overlap is and that sort of line between that subcommittee's charge and ours. So again, this pathway really focused on how do we provide tools and best practices for reductions of fossil fuel use across those particular partners. There were 2 strategies. Again, one focused on providing tools and resources to help assess fossil fuel use, assess data needs, and then provide best practices. And then strategy 2 was focused on equitably expanding access to programs that provide options to with a focus on rural homeowners, landlords, municipalities, school districts, universities, and hospitals for weatherization, electrification, and utility upgrades. So I wonder, Anne, if I could hand it over to you to give a flavor of what this task group focused on and what some of the actions focused on.
Sure. Thank you, Marion. So strategy 3.1, that's basically about gathering fuel use data and sharing best practices. It seems relatively straightforward and not too complicated to do. Strategy 3.2, we came up with a giant list of 16 sub strategies, and some of them had sort of, two sentences reflecting two different things to do in each one of those items. So just to pull several, just to pull a short list, public education and raising awareness of opportunities to make improvements came up a couple of times. Another idea was to evaluate state-funded programs, expand workforce development, improve building codes so that it includes a 20-amp service, so that that's a requirement for new homes and rental homes. Reducing statutory barriers for capital projects and land use purchases. And let's see, making sure that there are navigators at the regional planning commissions that can help people understand this giant morass, which it really is, of opportunities. It's hard for people to figure out what to do, in terms of the individual homeowner. Ben, you have your hand up.
Well, when you're done, Ann, I have a comment on strategy 3.2, or maybe an observation for our consideration this time around.
Go for it.
Well, so as we're doing the public assistance infrastructure recovery from last summer's flooding, we're sort of the $600 million tip of the spear in terms of climate adaptation. And there are lots of opportunities that come around as we decide what gets rebuilt, how it gets rebuilt, where it gets rebuilt, and try to maximize the opportunities with FEMA to become more resilient. And for education institutions, I want to talk about some siloing that I see, because one of the big policy questions that our legislature is wrestling with is the future shape of our public school system. And we are dealing with schools that got flooded. Montpelier High School, there's an elementary school down in Andover that was in the floodway and probably shouldn't be rebuilt there. And so we can try to maximize the mitigation of those facilities, in some cases the relocation of those facilities, using public assistance. But I don't see the Agency of Education engaged. And there are questions that require some analysis that I don't think anybody has taken on yet. For example, should we rebuild Montpelier High School in that location? U32 is right up the road, and there's a cost-benefit analysis. There are transportation trade-offs if we consolidate. I don't know that the transportation carbon footprint impacts have been fully integrated into our thinking about how much centralization is going to occur in our education system. So there may be a piece of analysis that feeds into our education infrastructure planning that nobody owns yet, that could be identified as work over the next 5 years. Does that make sense? It's a little abstract, but we're having to make these decisions in real time about what to do about these flooded facilities. And in the back of my mind is this, wait a minute, this ties to something else that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight, and definitely I just jotted down like that's a potential gap, and I think that's sort of getting beyond the pathway and strategy level, but it helps us lead to a potential gap that we might need to fill, and wonder if it's reflected in the survey. But we're going to go through the survey, and we're going to go through an exercise to jog our minds for what more we should have put in the survey, or if we didn't get an opportunity to fill a survey. So we'll do that. So I kind of want to keep at the high level, and we have 2 more pathways to get through before the next 10 minutes. So Alice, if your comment is sort of at that high level, go ahead and provide it. And if it's at maybe a little bit more about a gap, then maybe save it for the next exercise. But
Yeah, I just very quickly would say that I support what Ben is saying, because it's exactly what we're looking at also. in the Central Vermont Regional Plan rewrite. And the other thing people should be aware of for municipalities is that when the new FEMA mapping comes out, there will be changes and enhancements that will have to happen to municipalities' bylaws for the flood hazard areas.
Thanks, Alice. All right, to Andrea's point, we're going to move right along. We have 2 more pathways and then a couple of quick cross-cutting pathways as well that we'll review for you all. So pathway 4, I don't think I have anyone else tag teaming this one with me, but if there are folks who were on the subcommittee last time who recall working on this one, feel free to chime in. So pathway 4 was really focused on land use policies, thinking about how our current and future land use development will be adaptive and resilient to climate change impacts. 2 strategies here with a handful of actions underneath. The first was really looking at increasing investment in infrastructure needed to support communities to ensure they're more resilient to climate disruptions. Really focused on sewer, water, stormwater, sidewalks, bike lanes, EV charging, broadband energy supply. So this was sort of a broad one, but fell within the focus on land use policies and land use development. And strategy 2 was focused on developing permanent private and public funding sources to flood-proof, elevate, and purchase commercial and residential properties, as well as conserve and restore ecosystem services upstream. Just a handful of the actions to highlight for you all here that fell within those 2 strategies. Quite a few focused on sort of stormwater permitting, stormwater siting, stormwater vulnerability assessments for municipalities. Another focused on establishing a dedicated comprehensive state level program with funding to purchase or match funding for flood hazard properties. And another action focused on funding ERAF for non-federal disasters in towns that have adopted floodplain and or river corridor bylaws. So it's interesting that actually reading those actions, they feel connected to some of the other pathways as well, and not just focused on land use policies. So I think, and again, I didn't work on this one, so I don't have a lot of detail, additional background to provide you all, but we'll stop just for a minute to see if anybody else on the subcommittee did work on this particular pathway to provide some additional detail. And if not, we'll move on. And again, encourage folks to take a look at the matrix that's linked in the chat, and that has all the actions in there if you want to get more of a flavor of what's included. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to pathway 5.
Sorry, Marion, just a quick question. Under the original matrix that you had up on the screen originally with all the actions under the strategies, there was a compact settlement pathway number 1 that was under pathway 4.
We're getting there. Yeah, so that was moved into cross-cutting pathways, which I'll preview a bit later.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Marion, I think I can provide just maybe a little bit of context for the land use and why it seems like, oh, it's a little bit all over the place. I mean, I came into the climate action plan sort of new to the state and as it was underway, but if I'm recalling correctly, land use was kind of just dispersed or sort of hidden in other things, and we really wanted to bring land use kind of up to the front and center of, I think Ben mentioned it earlier and said it really well, is that, you know, what we build, where we build, and how we build, and our use of land really has a huge connection to both emissions and resilience. And so this land use policy started as something that was just in resilience, but then really wanted to highlight that land use does have a strong connection to both resilience and emissions reduction. It doesn't really fit into one or the other. So some of the actions stayed here in the resilience pathways, but then many of the other actions went into this, what we called cross-cutting. They really kind of have a strong impact or nexus with both climate outcomes. So.
That's, yeah, great background. And I think kind of answers your question, Scott, as to why in that matrix, you'll see some of those actions included there, but there should be a little red box around them and a note that says this was moved to cross-cutting pathway around compact settlement, I believe is what it was called. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So Bronwyn, if you want to stay on the camera, because I'm moving to pathway 5, which is really focused on ensuring folks and people across Vermont have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing. There were 3 strategies included under this pathway. The first was really focused on updating state and local land use, governance, regulations, practices to eliminate barriers to housing development. The second was looking at increasing investments in the preservation development of both private market and nonprofit owned affordable housing. And the third was increasing access to fair and affordable housing for Vermonters who are housing unstable. And I think this was, there was a lot of discussion in the subcommittee last time around, a couple of years ago, around housing as a key, really a key strategy to ensuring we are more resilient to climate change impacts. There was a lot of discussion around, you know, those that are, many of those that are most vulnerable in our communities are those that don't have access to housing. They are often the first that feel the impacts of climate disasters, and ensuring that folks have access to safe and accessible housing and affordable housing means we are more resilient as a community and as a state as a whole. So Bronwyn, I'll turn it over to you to provide a bit more flavor as to the focus of this pathway.
Yeah, I think you stated some of it pretty well, but maybe just to elaborate a bit more, I think we were really trying to connect and integrate these 2 crises, the housing crisis, and connect it to the climate crisis. They're very much related, and certainly in terms of climate, there's, you know, a long background in thinking of housing in terms of energy and emissions reductions opportunity there. There's a long history of thinking about housing that's in the floodplain, but, you know, I think we wanted to take it just a little bit of a deeper dive and just talk about just the lack of housing, period, lack of affordable housing, lack of variation in the housing that's available in the state, and the need to increase housing supply in order to keep people housed affordably, stably. And that's just sort of a foundational thing that we have to work on in order to also then have communities that have humans who are stable in their housing and therefore can be more resilient to climate impacts, whether it's housing that's in flood safe areas, housing that can provide safe retreat for heat events or air quality events with wildfire smoke, et cetera. So housing has always been something that's sort of been one of the sectors in climate, but we really wanted to just take it a step further, especially in Vermont, and really connect the crisis to it and the need to build and make room to build more housing and build it in a way, as I said before, where what we build and where we build it and how we build it is really important and has this connection to climate. So thinking about, well, not just thinking about, I guess one of the things to mention is that the Home Act from 2023 started to make some moves in this, basically preempted local zoning to ensure that zoning was more permissive of different scales of housing, 2 to 4 unit housing structures in places that already have infrastructure to support that. So, you know, being sort of conserving land and putting houses in places where it can also meet some of our other climate goals, like not having to drive as far to get to work or to get to school. And it's just by nature more affordable to have smaller units and on less land. So the Home Act was a good start to that, but obviously there's still a lot more work to be done in terms of being able to build housing. I think one of the things I've said before, and I'll just flag it here again, I think we do a really good job of identifying where is not a good place to build new, but I think we need to kind of, well, where can we put housing that is flood safe, that is affordable and accessible to communities and help support local economic development and the people that we need here in the state. So I guess I'll leave it there for housing and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts.
One question in the chat, Candace was asking if managed retreat or some other terminology that speaks to sort of the concept was included in any of these. My option is it was not. Ben put some good context in about sort of how the hazard mitigation program is thinking about it. But I think, you know, Candace, that to your question, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bronwyn, but I think that kind of highlights a gap and could come up in our sort of next conversation around where there are gaps and areas folks might want to focus.
Yeah, well, Ben has a response in there as well. I would agree. Maybe I think that the terminology, I mean, even after the floods in 2023, we saw a wide range of concepts of like, what do we even mean when we say managed retreat? Are we, are we talking about lifting the entire Montpelier downtown and moving it elsewhere? Or are we talking about identifying a couple key properties to help increase access to floodplain while also working up and downstream? I mean, what does that look like? I think a lot of the work that's been done in managed retreat, are at least some of the stuff that I've seen, is very much in coastal communities where, I mean, they are quite literally just losing land. Like the land is no longer going to be there for the entire community to, it's sea rise. I think it's a bit different of a conversation in river adjacent communities where, while we know that we'll see more frequent river flooding and perhaps more frequent sort of meandering of rivers, what does that retreat look like in a river community versus coastal? And I think maybe those are conversations that we need, but yeah, I would agree. Maybe don't start with calling it managed retreat, or at least start having conversations about, like, be more specific about what we're talking about when we say that, or whoever's saying it. What do we mean when that phrase is being used?
Thanks, Bronwyn. All right, in the interest of time, we do need to move on. Alice, do you have a quick question?
I just want to let folks know that came across my screen as we're talking about housing is an article on mobile park in Berlin being rebuilt as in the same spot where it was mega flooded this summer, and it's worth reading. It's even talking about, is it legal to do so? I posted the link in the chat.
Thanks, Alice. All right, we do have to move on. I have 3 more slides here, just an awareness for folks. So the next 3 are what were considered cross-cutting pathways. So after subcommittees in 2021 developed their actions, there was an acknowledgement that there are some themes, sectors, and areas of focus that cut across all of the subcommittees and don't fit squarely within one subcommittee's jurisdiction or area of focus. And so those actions were sort of pulled out. There were task groups made up of members from various subcommittees who met to refine those actions, refine the pathway, and speak to those in a more cross-cutting nature. I think that will certainly be a component of this next climate action plan's work. I'm not sure exactly what that will look like, but I think worth highlighting these. What I've pulled out here are the actions that just the Rural Resilience Subcommittee developed that were then pulled into these cross-cutting pathways. But we'll acknowledge there were other actions that other subcommittees like cross-sector and agriculture and ecosystems developed that also fell within these pathways. So the first one here, it didn't even have a pathway sentence. It was just workforce. The strategy, there was one strategy focused on supporting workforce development in trades and skills that are needed to implement the climate action plan. So real acknowledgement that workforce development and sort of the need for workforce, particularly in our state, is fundamental to ensuring that a lot of the actions included in the climate action plan can actually get implemented. And then the action, I don't have it on the screen, but that the Rural Resilience Subcommittee included within that cross-cutting pathway was focused on providing workforce training and development to create apprenticeship programs for more homegrown rural builders with expertise in resilience and energy efficient building practices. So moving right along, this next cross-cutting pathway was really focused on compact settlement and had a lot of engagement and work from members of the subcommittee. There were 3 strategies. The first was really pulling that one that you saw earlier around increasing investment in infrastructure for compact, walkable development. So similar to some strategies you saw on some of the previous slides around infrastructure. The second strategy was focused on updating state and local land use governance, regulations, and practices to remove barriers to compact settlement and increase coordination on land use issues. And the third was around funding research, data collection, and digital maps to provide insights on land use decisions and the impact that it can have on climate and resilience goals. There are quite a few actions included under here. I would encourage folks to take a look at that matrix. Again, as Scott indicated, you can see these actions in the matrix. They'll just be highlighted by a red box. Anything quick to add, Bronwyn, on context for the compact settlement pathway?
Yeah, no, just to say that, this is pretty clearly to me someplace where the resilience and the emissions kind of combine, again, what we're building and how we're building it. Making sure that it's in flood safe areas, making sure that it's connected to other amenities so that we can reduce emissions, provide alternative methods of transportation, et cetera. So for me, it's very much both climate objectives are being addressed.
All right, and then the last one was a cross-cutting pathway focused on ensuring people have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing. This feels very similar to Pathway 5. I think I'm trying to remember where exactly this came from. I think there was a lot of crossover, again, with cross-sector mitigation, really thinking about emissions reductions, infrastructure, and technology for housing, for energy efficient housing. And so there was one strategy pulled in here that was increasing access to fair and affordable housing for Vermonters, and the one action that the Rural Resilience Subcommittee kind of pulled into this particular pathway was around building codes, auditing existing residential building codes to ensure that standards account for anticipated climate change impacts to Vermont, including but not limited to increased temperature extremes and precipitation. So again, there was discussion in the subcommittee around building codes, but because there was also work on building codes in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, those were sort of merged together into one pathway. So with that, I know we're over time, Andrea, apologies. I will stop sharing my screen. Actually, do you want me to keep my screen up? We can just move into the survey review.
If I could, I'm sorry, I can't find the raise my hand thing. Val brought this up in the chat a few minutes ago, and I'm not saying that we need to answer the question now, but I think it's an important question for the committee to discuss. And her question is this section on housing, Pathway 5, more about access to affordable housing and land use, or about the resilience of affordable housing? And what I want to discuss is that it is someone else's responsibility to provide an adequate stream of housing to the citizens of Vermont. It is not the Climate Council's responsibility, in my opinion. Our job is to make sure that if there is a response to the housing need for Vermonters, that it is resilient, that it will last through the extreme weather events of climate change. And this goes back to my original concern about, as we got into this, that this is a huge topic. And here is an area where I think that we can reduce our focus away from providing housing and meeting a need for housing, and stay focused on putting that housing, commercial properties, et cetera, in an area that will not be threatened by extreme weather. And I'm not looking for a debate right now, but we've got to solve that. And you now know where I stand on that.
Yeah, I guess to just talk about your comment about it's not the council's responsibility to provide for housing, I think is what you said. I think what we need to think about in this group is as we, as a state, look to, as the state is going to, it has to look for a way to help with the housing crisis, make sure that that is safe and accessible, energy efficient. All those things do have to do with resilience. So we have to kind of just keep that in mind as we go. And I think as we get through the sort of gap identification, the survey results, and we're going to start focusing and figuring out what we want to focus on most in this rewrite. So
Andrew, can I just add to that, I mean,
Yeah.
David, I would agree with you. It's not the Climate Council's responsibility to develop, provide the housing pipeline that's needed in the state, but I do think it's the Climate Council's responsibility to think about how its climate policies impact different sectors of housing development. And so just as an example, one of the things that housing developers are really challenged with is between federal requirements state requirements, they all drive up the cost of housing. And so housing providers are tasked with trying to create as many units as affordably as possible, but their sources of funding come with all of these additional requirements that nothing else in the housing industry is required to adhere to. So in coming up with our climate policies, and just as we do with all the other equity considerations, I think we really need to think about how climate policies might be impacting folks differently from an equity perspective. And that is the charge, I think, of the Climate Council, is to think through that when it's coming up with policies.
Mhm.
Well, we've done no one any favors at all in terms of creating housing, putting it in areas where it will be destroyed.
Right.
I'm not unhoused, so I can't speak to that, but I think it's important to speak to folks who are facing that housing crisis. And I think they might have a different response to that because they don't have the luxury of being in a place where they are stable, just thinking about long-term strategy. And I agree, it's both. And in some cases, I think I agree. I don't think it does the state or individuals any good in the long term. But if it's the thing that's preventing them from being able to build enough units, period, then we need to figure out how to get more money to affordable housing providers to go above and beyond and meet all those requirements that we know serve Vermont in the long run. So again, it's just sort of figuring out, like, how do we lift up both goals together, create the housing that's needed and make it resilient without having to scale back on one or other of the goals.
Caroline, go ahead. And then we got to move on.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to change the subject completely, but with Pathway 2, I just wanted to point out that maybe it'd be helpful during gap analysis to have our dam safety office involved, because one thing I noticed was that dams are not mentioned anywhere in the climate action plan as it is, and we know that's an issue. So just wanted to say that now. I'm not sure when the right time was to say that.
Yeah, there could be potential to dig into that potentially in pathway 4 too, but I think that will come later, but it's noted. Yeah, so Marion, if you want to move on to the results of the survey, we're gonna have to kind of fly through this. Okay, so yeah, we put out a survey. We had 10 people respond. The first question was about where our focus should be. Really, this is high level, so this is sort of all of it. What do we want to focus on? And that's what we want to narrow down at this point. So 3 people thought like the focus is just right now. And then 2 people thought individuals should have a higher focus. 2 people thought community should be a greater focus. 2 people thought the natural environment should be a greater focus, and then 2 for the built environment also. So sort of spread out fairly evenly on those choices. And, you know, we just put those categories in as a prompt to get people thinking and asked what else. And so the what else's that came in were focused on the interdependencies of all of these. And we should place more focus on our most vulnerable residents, which is something we'll see kind of throughout as a theme in these questions. And then the next question, which of the following sectors should be better represented? And so we had 5 people. We've talked a little bit about public health and how that was a whiff and different, I think there's different elements to that, but public health came up as something I think it sounds like our subcommittee wants to be cognizant of including, whether it be its own pathway or how we incorporate it. We'll figure that out as we go, but definitely something that's important to most of us. Rural resilience, rural economic resilience coming in second, and then emergency management being up there. Again, maybe we can have a conversation of what that means to people after we kind of go through these results. Infrastructure resilience and community preparedness. I wonder if there's a connection there to emergency management too, preparedness. And then rural energy resilience. and housing weatherization and electrification. So those are things that people just thought that the plan as it stands now fell short on. And we can go on to the next one, Marion. And then for the pathways that need additional attention, the following themes or types of actions that need additional focus include, and financing was, you know, again, we sort of led you to answering in one of these categories, but we wanted to hear more from you. Financing came up on top, planning, and then justice and equity, definitely important. And then I think there was some comments along with that too. Marion, is that right? Yeah, so focus on what will make the biggest difference in the lives of the most vulnerable. In the realm of planning, assessment of threats and vulnerabilities, so more emphasis on that, possibly building on translating the Municipal Vulnerability Index to a useful way to target funding and efforts to build resilience. That's a good thought there. More focus on action as climate is changing. There was a comment or two on that earlier. Just trying to take into account as we do these plans, how rapidly the climate is changing, and then outreach, improving awareness, access, and mobilization. So definitely a variety of thoughts there, but no, go ahead, Marion. And then what else should rural resilience be considering as we move forward towards the next iteration, and sort of lumping these into some themes? Energy resilience was definitely on the minds of people. I think that certainly is a reflection probably of the makeup of our subcommittee and those who actually took the time to do the survey or were able to do the survey. Planning and implementation, metrics of success. I think that's a great comment. We should think more about that as a subcommittee. I'm not really sure moving forward with action or moving from planning to action, what that means. Maybe that's a reflection of us focusing in this exercise on the higher level, but I think there was one more slide. Helping municipalities understand flood mitigation and the role of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is an interesting thing. I think that's interwoven into what we have here, but maybe it just needs to come out more pointedly. More focus on emergency management, more focus on building resilience. And we just had this conversations, where do the new buildings go? How are they sited? And then rebates, loans, and grants for the most vulnerable. And that sounds like one of those things that we would want to consider, but also consider how to work with other subcommittees. And that's just something that we're going to have to do, especially with, I think, with a big focus on energy. I don't think that our subcommittee should shy away from anything. I think we should put all of our ideas out there. But then I think we have to do this service in a way that will make, especially with our prioritization goals for this year, to really narrow down and prioritize top actions, really working with cross-sector mitigation in that space, and then really also looking at what ag and ecosystems is doing on their plan and their revisions, and how we want to align with those. I feel like even just looking at the pathways and the strategies, when we just went through that exercise, I felt like, okay, we just said funding for housing in 3 different pathways. So are those different things? And then if they have 5 or 6 actions under those, are those actions really different? So that's where I feel like at some point we'll probably need to have some sort of facilitated exercise to really understand, even within our own recommendations and actions right now, where that crossover is, and then also with the other subcommittees, how we're being redundant, or if it's being called for and it meets different pathways and strategies, different subcommittees' charges, then does that just weight it to a very higher impact level? And that's something that helps us prioritize where we want to go. So we got those results. we wanted to take another couple of minutes in case there's some people on here who didn't get to take the survey, or now that we've kind of gone through things again, just do a Mentimeter survey again, and just to try to get some more input as we move forward and inform the direction that we want to go. So Marion, do you want to pull that up?
Yes. Wait, give me a minute. Yeah, so I think the idea here, folks, a lot of people have put in the chat or have voiced gaps and sort of areas where you're interested in working. I think that's fantastic, and that's what we're trying to capture here. We have a handful of kind of Menti, which is a polling tool. So you can click the link that I put in the chat, or I'm going to share my screen here, and you can go to menti.com and put the code in that's at the top of my screen here. But I think given all of that, we have a couple of sets of questions. So we'll start with this one. Given all what we just reviewed in terms of the 5 pathways that exist from the 2021 Climate Action Plan, and then we have those 3 additional ones, cross-cutting pathways focused on workforce, compact settlement, and housing access, where do you think we might need more focus? And I think the reminder here is that the charge of this subcommittee for this version of the Climate Action Plan is not to completely rewrite it. I think we're looking for ideas of where you all think additional focus needs to be paid. I didn't have enough space to put in all of the pathway language, so apologies if you want to go back and you can pull up that matrix and find what the names of the pathways were. But is the link working for folks?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And do you have it set so we can only choose one?
I do. Oh, sorry.
I think so. That's the way.
Not what I intended. Made this morning. Okay, give me a second.
Yes, Anna, you should. I think everybody on the call should provide their input to this.
Okay,
this is a little different in that we're just seeking some input rather than making a decision here. So so as far as who's voting, but
okay, it should work now. Val confirmed for me that you can do multiple options.
So should we click this new link?
I think it's the same, but yes.
Okay.
It works.
Are you able to select multiple?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So go ahead and put your responses in. I'm going to share my screen again, but you should be able to see as stuff comes up. Again, we're going to have a question later about sort of where you want additional focus. This right now is just going through the existing pathways and strategies. Where do you think we need additional focus? So let's see. Pathway 2, pathway 3. And again, just a reminder for folks as these are coming through, pathway 2 was focused on, well, let's see, I'll just go through one by one. Pathway 1 is focused on capacity for climate resilience and planning, climate resilience planning and implementation, and with a particular focus on under-resourced communities. So really, I think that was really focused primarily at sort of the municipal capacity level. Pathway 2, which is coming up in sort of second place here, is looking at strategic proactive investment in resilient infrastructure systems. Pathway 3 was focused on reducing fossil fuel use across various areas. Pathway 4 was the focus on land use policies. 5 was affordable, accessible, energy efficient housing. So let's see, we're having pathway 1, which is around that capacity for under-resourced communities for planning and resilient project implementation, coming up as number 1. And number 2, investment in proactive investment in resilient infrastructure. And then we're seeing some come up here too as well in the cross-cutting pathways. So that's some good reflection and really will, I think, force us to think about how we best collaborate with other subcommittees, because there's some interest in workforce, compact settlement, and then housing access as well. Great. All right, so let's keep that in mind as we move on to the next one. Hopefully this works, and it should switch to another question for you all if you have the same screen open. So this is shifting a little bit to reflect back the question that was in the survey that folks responded to, but knowing we only had 10 responses, we wanted everyone else to have a chance. So kind of shifting from the pathway focus, broadly, which sectors do you think need additional focus and representation? And if you have ideas that weren't reflected in the responses that we got from the survey, select other, and we'll have a screen in a moment where you'll be able to expand on what you mean by other. And folks have brought up a lot of great ideas. There was discussion of relocation, discussion of really housing focus, and brought up some great points. So I think if you have an idea that's not a broad sector idea that's not on the screen here, select other, and then we'll be able to capture that on the next question.
And I can't do more than one.
Oh, sorry. This is what I get for doing it this morning. Give me 1 minute.
No, thank you for doing it.
Give me 1 second here. All right, should work now. Sorry, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, so responses are coming in. I'm seeing public health come up as a key one. I only see one other. So again, if you wrote down ideas or you had questions of whether things were included in the last set of pathways that you didn't see there, put that in other, because we're going to want to capture that on our next slide. All right, I'm going to pull my screen back up so we can look at this together. All right, so public health still, so that matches with what was in the previous, the survey from earlier this week. The next is really focused on infrastructure resilience and community preparedness. And then we've got energy resilience and emergency management. Following that, we've got economic resilience, housing, and then some other. Okay, so it does look like a lot of folks are interested in focusing on public health. Acknowledging that that really wasn't addressed in any of the pathways. So I think a clear gap that we've discussed in the subcommittee previously. And then infrastructure resilience and community preparedness, which I think this was one that someone inputted on their own into the survey. And I think would be worth kind of teasing out a bit more what folks think of when they think of infrastructure resilience and community preparedness broadly. I think as Andrea noted, some of that could include a focus on emergency management. Okay. So I think digging in a little bit into all of the great comments folks have raised as we walk through the pathways, if you selected other as sort of a place you'd like to see more focus, or if you didn't select other but have additional ideas, use this word cloud and let's capture some of those ideas that weren't included in selections in the in that last slide. So this is a word cloud, so we just should be able to see what pops up. Insurance, great. School consolidation, which I think this is what Ben brought up, school consolidation with a focus on sort of the co-benefits and impacts and what that means for resilience and energy reduction as well. Any other thoughts? Are there questions or topics that you thought should have been covered in the last cap or that you heard in conversation that are really bringing up additional areas of focus? Affordability, incentives, okay.
Marion, I don't know how to fix the typo on consolidation.
That's okay. We know what you meant, Ben. I don't know how to fix it either, so all good. It's only a recorded meeting, captured forever. I am seeing some themes here, and if you're seeing stuff that resonates with you all, feel free to put the same terminology in and it will sort of grow in the word bubble, so we'll be able to see it bigger as more folks are interested in it. I think what's curious is, you know, we had one of the questions in the survey was around sort of financing options, and I think that applies to multiple sectors and multiple pathways, but with folks putting in affordability, insurance, and finance, I think all of those would have a key focus and an area in thinking about financing and affordability options, incentives as well. Okay. Well, We'll keep gathering responses here. I think we'll share these slides out after. And Andrea, I'm going to take the screen down, but I think if you want to move us into a conversation about what's next.
Yeah. All right. So I think the next charge and something that we really need to start moving forward on, and we'll introduce this, and then I don't think I see anybody for public comment. So I think we're okay there, but we'll break in a second just to make sure. It's just sort of talking about how we might carry out this work and our best approach to do that. Given that we certainly cannot rewrite the plan or even provide minor edits as a whole group in a couple of hour meetings here and there. So we're going to have to break into task groups of sorts, and it sounds like that's the way it was done for the first iteration of the plan. And then, so I just wanted to solicit input. If you were, involved in the writing of the initial climate action plan, and there was a way that you all broke up into the work, then I would love to share that with everybody else who hasn't been involved yet. And then, open it up to other ideas of how we should split up the work and what we think we should be focusing on. So if there's anybody that is willing, who was involved in the last writing, to share how that sort of was organized, that would be nice to hear about. I wasn't there. Somebody had to be there. I feel like Anne, you were there, right? And the two Anns.
I'll start off. I mean, basically we just brainstormed and then we tried to group things. And that's how we developed the major pathways and tried to put the strategies under each pathway. And we had a lot of visits from the other subcommittees, particularly science and data, and the other subcommittees that kind of overlapped with our charge. The other one that we visited with was the one that was working on the sort of, we were more on the built environment and they were more on the natural environment.
Mm-hmm. But did you do that through task groups?
We did have task groups. We had small subcommittees working on task groups.
Were those organized by sector, or how would you split that work up?
Well, I would say, I mean, my recollection is we knew that we wanted to do something on the toolkit, the toolkit for municipalities. So Marion led us through that. We created a small work group. I was on that work group. Does this sound like how's my recollection, Marion?
Yeah, I think you're thinking of sort of what we did after the climate action plan was adopted, but you are right in that there were task groups grouped by pathway. I think the co-chairs of the subcommittee in 2021 developed a work plan similar to how we have, based on the charge of the subcommittee from the Global Warming Solutions Act, and then broke out pathways based on that charge. So that's where we got pathway 3, which was really focused on fossil fuel reduction, which Anne worked on, and some of the other pathways around land use and sort of resilient planning and solutions for rural impacted communities. So the pathways were, I don't think we went through a process of identifying sectors. It was more identifying pathways based on the charge from the Global Warming Solutions Act, and then subcommittee members broke out into task groups. And I think important to note that these task groups were really led and supported by the members of the subcommittee and staff support. Like I, at the time, was a staff support, and I didn't attend every task group meeting. Those were sort of self-led and self-guided by members, small group members from the subcommittee. And then we came together at subcommittee meetings to review the work, review the draft actions, and then eventually get to a point where we ranked and sort of prioritized them for inclusion.
Yeah,
that's my memory of it. If others have different memories, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I know at least with our pathway, like Joe Segali he was sort of the leader of our small little band, and he kind of took the first stab at drafting various iterations. I feel like there were some instructions that we got from the Climate Council, or from somewhere outside of the subcommittee on how to sort of organize and frame things. But then we took that and then had kind of a lead, and then the rest of us supporting and iterating with Joe. And that might have just been his MO, his way of working with us. I don't know if was the same for the other pathways, but it worked well.
I guess 5 subgroups seems like a lot to me. If we were to continue to break up into task groups of pathway. And so I kind of wonder about that versus task groups based on different sectors or whatever
Can I
those might be.
make a suggestion for 3 groups: housing, health, and process. And by process, I mean just sort of anybody who wants to join to keep it moving forward. But the 2 areas that this group wants to focus on, based on what the exercise we've just been through, is housing and health.
Is it housing or was it community capacity?
I can return my screen. There was a lot of discussion on housing, but actually, if you look at the results, no one said that pathway 5, which was the housing pathway, needed more work.
Right.
And the kind of most prioritized sectors, public health was number 1, infrastructure resilience and community preparedness was number 2, rural energy resilience was number 3, and emergency management. So
I would suggest that it really needs to be, I like your idea of breaking it down into small sectors, David, or small groups, but it really needs to be community, because the municipalities, particularly the tiny municipalities, it's very difficult for us, and there's a lot that we could be doing that the larger communities are doing. And if we just focus on housing and health, we're leaving out that. I mean, housing is great, but it, in some ways it applies to individuals and landlords and developers.
Let me expand by housing that's shorthand for me for infrastructure, personal property and infrastructure. They go hand in hand. They are the same thing.
So is it public health, community, and infrastructure? Or see, that's where you start to get that overlap, because community has infrastructure, right? And so go ahead, Alice.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to form a new idea here. Housing has been definitely the theme of everything that Waitsfield as a municipality is doing. For wastewater, it's housing. For a new town center plan, it's housing. And what I think is, and I looked at what we wrote in our town plan, and it needs adjusting again. And I think what's happening is exactly what we're talking about here. We're not talking about equity. We're not talking about sectors that need to be serviced by housing and why. And we're not talking about climate resilient kind of housing. It's just gotta build, gotta build, gotta build. And I think that what we could do in the climate action plan is to recommend the forgotten groups and the groups that have housing built in areas that are at risk again from extreme weather events, and the people, the growing problem in Vermont is homelessness. And when you talk about affordable, well, what does affordable mean? You know, the affordability is becoming a lower and lower and lower income threshold and getting people that are unhoused into housing. So, you know, do we say that anything that's built should be built with climate resilience technology and infrastructure? I think it's more a matter of how we address the needed housing, why and how. And I'm just, like I said, I'm just starting to form this idea. I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility about how we talk about housing.
Can I just jump in here a second? I want to support what Alice has just said. And it's not just small communities, and it's also larger communities. I mean, we're 10,000 people here in Essex Junction. We're facing some of the same problems, and some of the problems related. I'm okay with housing as long as we deal with policies and so on that affect how housing is either rehabilitated, and especially for low-income renters, residents, and landlords, and also how we have codes in place that allow us to make sure that housing that's built is built to standards that's going to minimize emissions and make it more adaptable and resilient for residents. So, for example, we don't have a building code in Essex Junction, so we can't insist in our land development code that new developments have infrastructure built in place for future EV charging stations. We can only recommend it. So housing's okay for me as long as we make sure that it's not just about affordable housing, is what Alice was just saying, is it's what kind of housing, what do we need to put in place policy-wise to make sure that we can do that at a municipal level.
I feel like we have a bit of an inconsistency, if I remember from the two slides, and maybe they're not supposed to be reflective of one another, but the survey that we filled out today, Marion, kind of, if we were going to narrow it down to 3 task groups, I'm not sure if our thoughts aligned between 2 of the questions asked, and I was wondering if you could bring those back up really quickly.
What do you want me to bring up? The survey results or the Menti?
No, the Menti.
The Menti. Okay, give me a second. You should be able to see if you click the link, but I can pull these up as well. Yeah, I mean, we asked sort of, similar questions, but different focus. So the first one was on, given the existing pathways, where do folks want to focus? And there was a lot of interest. Again, pathway 1 is really that question around capacity and support to rural communities for broad resilience planning. So I think that's what Anna's pointing to. I think Scott gets to it a little bit and acknowledging that larger communities need that support as well. It wasn't just focused on housing, but sort of the planning and the systems by which communities get support. So a lot of folks said that would be a place to do additional focus. Pathway 2 was the one around infrastructure resilience broadly, did not include housing, included systems to support housing development and growth, but was not
wastewater.
And then, wastewater, exactly. And then we had next was interest in workforce, followed by compact settlement, housing access. And then after that was pathway 3, which was the focus on fossil fuel use reduction, pathway 4, which I'm forgetting, and pathway 5, which was focused on housing. So I think we've talked a lot about housing, but when it comes to the survey result, only one person said that pathway 5 needed more focus. So I think that's maybe, Andrea, where you're flagging some.
Well, yeah, and I'm just, if we just look at the top 3 there, which is communities, infrastructure, and workforce, maybe housing and settlement sort of being close there, or maybe even being higher if there's some sort of combining of those. But then if you go to the next question, just kind of wanted to see how these align. They're different, of course, but We got public health clearly. And then there's
Which
infrastructure and
wasn't captured
community.
in the first question because it wasn't captured at all. So I think, or captured in the last climate action plan. So I think that's why there's that difference there.
Yep, and then infrastructure resilience and community preparedness kind of lumped together there.
And references to housing kind of float. I think they're appropriate to public health, infrastructure, emergency management. You know, emergency management has a large responsibility for unhoused people during flooding events. So I think housing is an element that it's a theme, or at least part of any one of these priority sectors that we've identified.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I feel like I'm just starting to realize like there's just going to be crossover. There's no
Yes.
distinct lines. Bronwyn, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I don't love the idea of burying housing, but if we're thinking about this from the perspective of a municipality, I think you could make the case for thinking of housing as a municipality's infrastructure. It's not infrastructure in the same way that existing pathway 2 is. That's looking at sort of, you know, public infrastructure, although some of it, water infrastructure, you know, is private. So if that helps to kind of think from a community perspective about why housing needs to be sort of considered as they're addressing climate, whether it is we need more housing to support the tax base, increasing costs of our systems that are being hit with climate impacts, or whether it's we need the workforce to do this work and the workforce needs housing, or you know, whatever it might be. Maybe that's another way of wrapping in housing. I would agree with Alice that I feel like it's just one of those cross-cutting things. None of this fits into an easy box. It's all interconnected. And so I just wanted to plug what Val had mentioned, which is if we do break up into groups, I think it would be helpful for those groups to be in regular communication to identify those places where one group is talking about housing in this way and the other group is talking about housing in this other way, bring it together, or, you know, what financing, right? Or whatever it might be, to try and find those places where it connects.
Definitely. Is there anyone feeling like they have enough clarity to say, if we're going to break up into 3 work groups, what those are going to be called? Because we kind of got to name them. We got to categorize them somehow to get moving on them. Or we go back to the pathways and then there's crossover that way. So I feel like this is a critical juncture for us right now to be moving forward.
Well, so I'll do this a little while thinking out loud. I think public health, I think while there were some comments in the chat around how public health you could kind of nest under these other sectors and topic areas as well, I think there's enough interest in focusing on public health, and there's an acknowledgement that it really wasn't addressed at all in the last climate action plan. So I would argue that should sort of be one group of people, and we'll, you know, survey folks from the subcommittee who would be interested in working on that group and really narrowing in on what the focus is for public health and where there's connections to other groups. I think based on this question and the conversations from Anne and others, sort of local capacity needs to do resilience planning and resilience implementation broadly. One that seems like that's really an interest of diving back into pathway 1 and really figuring out where did we make progress on this and where didn't we. I think that could include conversations, as Bronwyn noted, on housing and sort of the needs there for communities to address policies, barriers, and access to housing, and really thinking about the broader questions of how do we make that housing resilient in the face of climate impacts. So I would suggest, but feel free to push back, that we sort of group housing under like a community, I don't know what we call it, community capacity group or municipal capacity or something like that. And then the third, I think it seems like based on this and, you know, some of these other topic areas, there is interest in really focusing on like energy resilience and energy resilience in infrastructure. So perhaps that's a separate group to kind of think not at the municipal level, but sort of at the broader, you know, state level around our public. Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little lost, I guess, on what the last group could be.
Go ahead,
But
and I
there's some
know,
ideas. Yeah.
I know we're going over, so thank you for hanging in there. But go ahead, Ann.
Ahead of me.
Oh, I know Brown, one of yours was left over.
Oh. I mean, I just wanted to say, I think there's some merit to, you know, we've done all this work already on organizing principles around the pathways. And I think there's some consolidation that could be done, but I don't know what happens with all of our recommended strategies and actions if we kind of completely reorganize. And I do think there's merit to keeping the infrastructure, since it is so interdependent, just a broad infrastructure group, whether it's, you know, energy, communications, water, wastewater, transportation. I think we could add housing to that as well. I think that would make sense. But we could bounce off public health frequently in all the different ways that infrastructure is connected. And then, so public health infrastructure writ large, including housing, and then the sort of community capacity piece of it would be my suggestion.
Yeah.
So I'm
I
sorry.
heard three things. Sorry. I just heard public health, community capacity, and infrastructure. But
Yeah, Candace in the chat lists it as public health, infrastructure and built environment, and community resilience.
those are the three things I just said too. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. I like that.
Yeah, well, no,
Okay.
Caroline has a slightly different take: public health, infrastructure, housing, and homes. Although Caroline, your point around environment and ag, I mean, that's where there's a lot of crossover with the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, which is really focused on like the natural and working lands piece. So I think less of a need for this subcommittee to think about it, but there was crossover last time between the two, and there likely will be this time as well.
Right.
Yeah,
I
I
feel
support
like
kind of Candace's three groupings.
I do too, and I feel like community, some of the pathways that we already have, or the strategies under the pathways, that relate to community resilience have to do with some of what I would think of as the ag and ecosystem kind of, I don't know, crossover. But go ahead, Bronwyn, and then David, and then I think we should hang up.
I love a good categorization exercise.
Right.
Works. It speaks to my like scientific brain, but it just never, like, right, nothing ever fits in a perfect category. I guess maybe just a downer thing to say is that, as much to Ann's point, like, I think we can maybe think about, you know, regrouping or recategorizing or streamlining a bit, but to be quite frank, I don't think that simplifies, right? Like, they're still just very big topics. Even if you put housing infrastructure, it's still just a big thing. Now we're just matching it to something else. I appreciate thinking about, and Caroline's comment that ag and natural lands does seem to be missing from that public health, infrastructure, and built environment, and then community resilience. And I guess for me as well, again, that agricultural natural working lands has a strong overlap with economic resilience. Again, I think from a community's perspective, those two things, it's, you know, what are your natural resources, and what is your what's your local economy? If there's a lot of ag, then it's sort of both natural resource ag and local economy kind of tied together. So and Ben said, you know, maybe not rush this, and I feel like we're getting close. Public health, infrastructure, and built environment, and community resilience. I guess I think of the community resilience as being that capacity piece, both the social capacity, the political capacity to do things. I feel like that's kind of where that soft stuff falls. But then there's still that missing piece of the natural working lands, and as that ties to economy. So not helpful at all.
David, go ahead.
As you, if you will, come down to the wire, and in terms of housing, I just want to reiterate, our responsibility is resilience, not supply. And that we should not be in the business of stimulating housing or anything else other than to make sure that it's not going to get wiped out by the next extreme weather event. I would I spent a lot of years of my life providing housing to low-income people, but that is not the charge of this committee.
And I agree. I have a little bit of like nervousness and even changing a different approach than what was done last time and sticking to the pathways, but I think it can be done. I think it's going to be complicated no matter what we do, and we're going to have to communicate. We're probably going to have to up our frequency of meetings to be able to do that effectively, especially with the other crossover for other subcommittees. So I don't want to rush it, but I am starting to feel an urgency, thinking like, okay, the next time we're going to meet is in July, and in July we had, and according to our work plan, and that's going to be fluid, definitely, but we want to refine our gaps. And so maybe, we'll get a sense of if we think this is right, and we can finalize that in July, but we also want to do a capacity evaluation and hear from people that were named to do the work and see what the issues are. And I think that will help us refine the gaps a bit more too. So if you have thoughts on who that should be, either throw it in the chat now, or if you need to go back and revisit the progress report to make some suggestions on that, then please do that and send those recommendations to me of who we need to hear from. But if you can try to do that soon, that would be best, because we have to line up people to come. I'll send out another survey. I probably will send out a survey for both the July and August meetings, because I feel like we need to make sure, especially as summer approaches, kind of make sure we have meetings on the books now. And I think for now, we'll try to lump it into those groups and gauge some interest on who wants to be in those, and I'll send something out to solicit input on that from people here and people not here. And then, yeah, we'll definitely be hearing again in July about the CAP outreach and sort of debriefing on that too. So definitely, it's definitely, we're in the planning phase, and that's fine. So we'll just keep gathering information, but just want to make sure that we're not spinning too much, because we could spin a lot. There's, like we talked about, there's a lot of overlap. And okay, I think that's it. Anybody have any other closing thoughts there? Thank you for sticking it out longer than we were supposed to. The 2 hours goes by quick. All right, then we will see each other. I'll put out a survey for when we can meet in July.
Thank you all.
Happy kickoff to summer. It's happening.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yes, hot week next week.
Thanks all.
Yeah.